All right, so because we weren't in class last week, I kind of wanted to get a feel for what your thought was so far on on the D2L components, on the material, um, on using the book Dreamland instead of um, a textbook. I know textbooks can be used as references. Um, but sometimes I like to use kind of a real book instead of a textbook. So how's it going? What are your thoughts on anything, basically? I just want to see how you think everything's going after the first 2 weeks. All right, crickets must be going great. I'll assume that. Um, So the other thing is, like I said, the first part of this class, the live part, we're going to be talking about a variety of addictions in general. Every week we'll cover a different kind of addiction, but the online component does focus on opioid addiction because, you know, that's one of the primary addictions you'll be dealing with as a therapist. Um, so it goes into great detail every week. I had an entire class just on opioids, but they don't offer that anymore. So I included it in the addictions class. So that's why there's so much on opioids, but I think it's appropriate. So you're going to get the general addictions, but you're also going to get kind of a focus on opioid addiction and the history of it each week. So that's kind of the mix. Um, and I know I'm gonna read your I'm gonna read all your discussion posts, and I'll probably grade the first 2 weeks this weekend, at least the first week. And so I will read what you have to say, but did you have any questions about any of the material on the first or second week that was covered on D2L or anything else? Some of these articles were a little in depth, but you know, get what you can from them. All right, so let's look at week 3. And so I'm going to talk about alcohol addiction, tobacco addiction, 12-step programs. But I do kind of want to show you what is on the D2L page. So this, I have a lot from national resources. So um, this first one is basically, explaining the cycle of addiction. Um, and I do have a video on this in the opioid section, but if you look at this cycle of addiction, um, you know, I think that uh, when we begin quitting anything, you know, uh, we either do it cold turkey, we taper off, but at some point we stop. And then there's kind of this passage of time, and it doesn't really talk about it in detail, but there's both kind of the physical urges, but there's also the emotional urges to use whatever it is. And that's because most addictions are comorbid in some way. It's a way we deal with anxiety or depression or something that triggers us in our lives, maybe family problems or loneliness or whatever it might be. Or maybe something negative that's happened to us. When something triggers us, when we begin to feel those emotions that are separate from the addictions, it connects us with the urge to use because we were medicating in certain ways. There are other things that trigger us. If we weren't self-medicating, then it could have been something we were doing socially with peers. There may have been peer pressure. It may have been something that we do with others as a group. And then we feel as though we're the odd one not doing it. Another thing that could be happening is it may lower our inhibitions. And so if we're anxious about doing something like going out in public or meeting new people or maybe start dating, whatever it might be, that might be the reason people use, because, lowering our anxiety also lowers inhibitions, makes us more social, more comfortable in certain spaces or situations. So there's lots of emotional reasons why, we begin to think about using these urges. And then there are the physical urges. So there's the emotional component and the physical component. So the physical component, depending on what the addiction is, in one sense, they're all different, but in another sense, they're all the same. They're all different because, it's a different drug. It affects us differently. Some help to sedate us. Some help to make us more alert. Some give us a sense of love and belonging, depending on what it is. Some reduce anxiety. So there's lots of reasons we have a drug of choice. But whatever it is, the thing that's the same is that whatever that drug is, it's just a delivery system for the chemical entering our brains. And that delivery system needs some type of process which becomes a ritual in order to get it into our bodies. So for example, the smoking, you go down to your corner gas station, everybody knows you, they know what type of cigarettes you smoke, you know, and you say hi, get some coffee, buy a pack of cigarettes, bounce them against the palm of your hand. You take off the wrapper, they smell pretty good. The sound of the lighter, whether it's a Zippo or a Bic, is distinctive. There's a whole ritual process involved in whatever the drug it is, whether it's alcohol or an opioid. There's an entire ritual process that people become comfortable with. So when we either have an emotional need or we have an internal physical urge because of the dependency that was created, or a combination of the two, then that creates internal frustration or anxiety. And the next thing that happens is fantasizing. But it's really about fantasizing about a few different things. Fantasizing about relieving the emotional anxiety, whatever it is, fantasizing about relieving the physical urges, but it's also fantasizing about the ritual process. And so fantasizing is really about relief and, oh, wouldn't it be nice? But I'm not going to. But as that urge heightens, so you kind of have like a bell curve, as you're moving up the slope, as the anxiety and urge and triggers and everything else heightens, and you move past that fantasy stage, you move into obsession, and that's when you begin thinking about the ritual. Once individuals begin obsessing about the ritual of use, whatever that is, it could be, the whole process of preparing a needle and heroin and everything else. It could be going to your favorite bar, the bartender, your favorite drink. He knows your favorite drink, or she, and, you're comfortable there. It could be the box they keep under their bed with a razor blade in it for cutting. It could be anything at all. It could be going to a bar where they want to find another individual because they have a sexual addiction. So there's all kinds of fantasies about rituals. But once people begin to obsess about the ritual, they almost always use. So they have to stop themselves before they begin to obsess about the ritual. Once they begin to obsess about the ritual, they want to carry out the ritual. And then, of course, the next thing is substance abuse, loss of control. Then people feel bad. There's guilt over the use, and they have to start the process over again. And that's pretty normal, People normally don't quit things the first try. So, because it's difficult, but that's just kind of like the cycle of addiction, as it says. Anyway, so this paper talks about each part in a very technical manner. There's also other resources there as well. So I'm just kind of giving you my take on these things, but also kind of introducing you to these resources that you can explore more fully on your own. SAMHSA website, this has a lot of good things. And they keep this pretty up to date. It's not stagnant. So you can look at all of the different resources on here. So many. It's a government organization. When we talk about alcohol, the NIAAA cycle of alcohol is very similar. So here we have kind of like, we're going to talk about it. They simplified this, but they applied it to different parts of the brain. And it goes into a little bit of an explanation of the cycle. This talks about alcohol in the brain in detail. It's a nice little overview of that. This talks about some of the medications, and I listed them here. If you click on it, you can see them. But those are the main ones for alcohol, but there's others. And this really talks about, this is a whole presentation about medication and the treatment of alcohol use disorder. And it's really like, it's a presentation, but it's like a little article. So I think my favorite resource, if you go to the Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book, the first thing you see is them trying to sell you the book, but even that's cheap. You know, they wanted to make it available to everybody. But if you scroll down and you click on any of these, so like if you click on chapters and you go to chapter 1, Bill's story, you can read the book for free. So somebody has, you know, some type of access to the web, anybody can read the AA book for free. So I think that's a pretty good thing. I don't want you to read the book. I just want you to kind of peruse it. Maybe you want to read Bill's story. It's only 16 pages. That's kind of how this whole thing got started. I have, these are PowerPoints that I put up that just kind of outline basic information, most of which I'll talk about tonight. There's 2 videos. One's on alcohol abuse, the other's kind of on human biology, genetics, and alcohol. And then there's a TED Talk on nicotine addiction, an article on the consequences of nicotine exposure. There's a PowerPoint on nicotine. And then starting here, we kind of get into the opioids again a little bit every week. There's 2 video lectures. One's on the diagnostic process for opioid addiction. One's on types of opioids. This is my Dreamland response for last week. This is opioid use disorder diagnostic criteria, web references for types of opioids, and the discussion board. So that's kind of what's on tap for this week. Not to use an alcohol reference, but that's our subject for tonight. All right, any questions before we start talking about alcohol? All right. So I'm going to highlight all the things that were kind of important to me going over this. And, you know, I think that I have a personal interest in the use of alcohol, not in me using alcohol, but because, let me just, yeah, because my dad was an alcoholic. And so I saw it from, you know, child of an alcoholic. So I know that he was in World War II, he was in Korea, Vietnam, 20, 25 years of service in the military, and then another 10 or 15 in the government. Cigarettes and alcohol were very acceptable to deal with the trauma of the military or wars or conflicts or anything else. It was not only a way to self-medicate, but it was a way to bond with other soldiers, other members of the military service. So it fulfilled a lot of roles. They used to give packs of cigarettes with every ration. So, you know, they would get food, pack of gum, some type of snack, like a tin of peanut butter and beans and whatever. So military rations, and they come in a bag. And but in that was always a pack of cigarettes. And you know, people in the military would smoke a lot of cigarettes. And we'll talk about why that is when we talk about tobacco and nicotine. But the essence is that it not only reduced anxiety, but it also kept them alert, kept them awake. They were spending long nights, or their senses were becoming dulled because of tiredness or fatigue. So I'm pretty sure my dad had PTSD, but it wasn't diagnosed back then. And he was self-medicating with alcohol, as did every one of his friends in the military. But it did have a lot of negative results with our family system. Fortunately, he did, go to a center. It was one of the original centers to treat alcoholism. It was set up by a guy named Father Martin. It was in Baltimore. It's still around today, even though Father Martin died. And I might be on one of the links. But yeah, so, and it worked. The problem is he never got treated for the emotional side of this. So did away with the self-medication, and then there was nothing. So, and of course I was too young to understand all this. By the time I became a counselor, he was pretty up in years. And there really weren't any resources for people back then. But that's kind of why I kind of care about alcoholism and that type of addiction, as well as PTSD and trauma. So now, and I mentioned this in the trauma class I teach, so now I volunteer with the Red Cross, and there's a special part of the Red Cross called Reconnections, and we work with military families, people who have been deployed, coming home from active duty and being reconnected with their families, and we run groups, and so it's connected with the Yellow Ribbon program, and I think it's really a valuable service for the military families. Talk about things to expect, talk about things that they may need to get more help with. One of them is alcohol use and drug use. So since, and it really depends on where people are being deployed, kind of the drug of choice, because different areas of the world are more conducive to producing various drugs. But ever since Vietnam and the Middle East, heroin has been the choice, because it's easily accessible when they're deployed in those areas. So another interesting fact is depending on where a conflict is, it seems that there's always an uptake in the drug of choice that's being produced in that area of the world in the United States. So there's always that correlation between what drug becomes popular in the United States and where we're fighting in a conflict around the world. So let's see. So that's kind of my personal interest in this. Another thing I want to dispel, kind of a myth, is you don't have to be an addict to work with addicts. You don't have to have schizophrenia to work with clients who suffer from schizophrenia. Why would you need to be an addict to work with people who are addicted to some substance? So a lot of times I will be working with somebody with an addiction, and one of the first things they ask me, without fail, is, am I an addict? Am I an alcoholic? Am I an addict? Whatever substance we're dealing with. And I don't answer the question. I say, well, I understand why you might ask that. However, it really doesn't matter whether I'm, an addict or an alcoholic. Every single person, every human being is dealing with some emotional struggle, whether it's an addiction or a diagnosis or a crisis or a loss or whatever it might be. So I can assure you, I've had a lot of struggles that I've needed to work through and overcome and receive therapy for. Uh, but um, and, I've been trained in addiction counseling, and I hope I'll be able to help you along this path, this journey to sobriety. They usually leave it at that. The thing is, what I don't like is if a client and a therapist or a client within a group of other clients start comparing addictions. Oh, well, I died 3 times. Yeah, well, I died 4 times. Whose addiction was worse? It's kind of a morbid competition to see whose addiction was worse or more severe. And there's really no comparing. That's what people need to understand. It's because it's not just the use of a substance. In every case, there's some self-medication, some comorbid issues or diagnosis, whether that diagnosis appeared before the use of the substance or after the use of the substance. There's some other emotional component going on. If it wasn't going on before, if it was just peer pressure, there's something going on after the addiction. I can guarantee it. So it's not about, comparisons or, oh, well, you haven't been through what I've been through. It's really about caring, compassion, empathy for another person going through a pretty severe struggle. And I think therapists understand that, but we have to share that understanding with everybody if it's a group. Everybody in the group needs to have that caring and compassion and empathy for each other. And that's the beginning of the therapeutic support group for addictions, whatever the addiction is. And then they'll be there for one another as each one struggles with that difficult journey to sobriety. So, we talked about the various reasons: self-medication, peer pressure, experimenting. It's different for young people or young adults. Having both an emotional and a physical dependence on, the results of the chemical in our brains. And, so when we think about how any chemical influences our brains, so it's a little complicated, but the chemical itself doesn't produce whatever feeling it is, euphoria or sedation or whatever. It changes our brains, and it either releases more or less of our own brain chemicals. I think the only thing that might be the exception is like Oxycontin, because that is a chemical that our brain produces. So opioids are probably a big difference. But our brain reacts to the chemicals we put in our bodies. The chemical goes through our bloodstreams, might start in our digestive system, goes through our bloodstream, enters our brain, and our brain reacts to those chemicals in different ways. So, you know, uh, alcohol is one of the oldest substances that we've used. And that's because it often occurs naturally. A lot of times we can find fruit or other things, or even wheat or grains that have naturally fermented. And that fermentation creates ethanol. So ethanol, alcohol, could have been helpful as a preservative because it gets rid of a lot of bacteria or germs, depending on the concentration or levels of the alcohol and whatever it is. Um, uh, a lot of times people would drink beer or wine instead of just water because of bacteria. Um, Beer made from fermented honey was called mead. Um, First time I had mead, I was in Europe, Germany, and they would have these giant stainless steel. They look like those big coffee makers that, but it wasn't coffee in them. I didn't realize that. So I put my cup under, poured a cup, and it was steaming hot, but it wasn't coffee, it was mead. And that's what, they drink to stay warm in those German winters. Um, so, uh, but first discovery of mead, um, first evidence is 9,000 BC. That's a long time ago. But they believe that it occurred 18,000 years ago in Egypt. So basically, through uh, our whole progress of discovery included some type of alcohol. Um, just before we had the independent breweries really take off, though, I guess it was 1987, maybe 1990. Yeah, around 1990, me and my friends started brewing beer. This was like before it was like really popular. So we turned an old stainless steel keg into a boiler and welded a spout on it, and we started making wheat beer with wheat and honey and hops and a few other things, and we liked it. Yeast, and so we ended up incorporating into a beer company. We called it One-Eyed Cat. The symbol, don't get me in trouble for this, but the symbol was like a cat with its tail up walking away. That's why it was called One-Eyed Cat. And see, I have no audience to laugh. All right. So, anyway, I got the opportunity. We got a contract with, it's called Arrowhead Brewery in Chambersburg, and they're a large brewery and they'll produce beer for various microbreweries. We got a contract with them, but then I had the opportunity to go back to school so I could continue brewing or I could go back to school. And I chose going back to school. I gave everything to my friend, my partner, and he didn't go anywhere with it, but he still brews beer. So I kind of understand this process. Uh, and I guess, beer and wine were around for thousands of years. The big difference was when people learned how to distill, because, beer and wine have an average of maybe 8% alcohol content, but when you distill something, you can have 40 to 80, maybe more percent alcohol. And that's when, you know, you've really concentrated the amount of alcohol. So that's the difference between beer, wine, and liquor. Um, and so a lot of people saw medicinal uses for this. I know that my grandma had a bottle of her medicine in the top of her closet, and specifically for colds or other ailments. But people would use, alcohol for all kinds of different things. When we think about it, some people classify alcohol as a hypnotic, to be specific. Um, it can produce a sense of well-being or euphoria. It lowers inhibitions. There's lots of pros and cons, but in one of the books I was reading, it said the lowering of inhibitions resulting from inebriation and the use of alcohol has resulted in millions of unplanned children. And, out of a textbook, I can understand the implications of that, but it's also resulted in a lot of other things like automobile accidents and other things. Even animals and insects are drawn to fermentation. I used to have a horse. At the end of the day, if he behaved, I'd give him a can of beer. He could hold it in his mouth and drink it himself, but he only got one. Let's see. Oh, they love beer. Yeah, they love it. That's why he only got one. So of course, alcohol leads to a lot of physical problems. Alcohol leads to problems with the liver, number one, because that's what processes most of the metabolized alcohol and filters it out of our bodies. But there's also problems with the stomach, problems with kidneys, problems with the pancreas. So depending on how much people actually drink, it results in more severe physical problems. So I did write down kind of, just so I get it right, how I've kind of distilled the way alcohol affects our brains. So, of course, it begins through our digestive system. It doesn't have to, but, 99% of the cases starts being through our digestive system because we drink it. And, once it moves through our digestive system, most of it through the intestines gets shifted to our bloodstream at the molecular level, and the bloodstream takes it up to our brain. So when it begins affecting and bonding with neurons, it also binds with GABA, stands for gamma amino butyric acid. That's why I wrote this down. And it acts as an inhibitor to our neurotransmitters in the brain. So this enhances the influx of chloride atoms into the neurons, slowing the firing rate. So this gives us a sensation of relaxation, and can also bind with 5-HT3, which is a component of serotonin receptor. It can result in memory loss, lowered inhibitions, psychomotor impairments, causes release of dopamine that results in a sense of euphoria. So this binding, so you can actually buy supplements for both GABA and 5-HT3. So, and you can take them at night. It helps people with insomnia go to sleep. You have to take both of them together, though. You can't just take one of them. It might actually keep you up. So the combination of GABA and 5-HT3 help to relax, help to give you a sense of, not so much euphoria with the supplements, but like everything's okay. And I guess it would help if you had rumination or racing thoughts and had trouble going to sleep. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of get that chemical process in our bodies exactly right for you, so I wrote it down. They might also, scientists are thinking it might interact with the mu opioid receptor site, which is kind of interesting. And that might also help result in a sense of euphoria. We talk a lot about that in the opioid section. So let's see. There are different levels to alcohol withdrawal or detox. And depending on how much people drink on a daily basis and what they drink and the alcohol level. But the most severe cases are called the DTs. That stands for delirium tremors. They actually had a beer called Delirium Tremors. It's kind of a sick joke naming it that. Their claim to fame was one of the highest alcohol levels in a beer on the market. But the problem with that is it's severe withdrawal, and people can have hallucinations and heart palpitations and seizures and a lot of other things. And most doctors agree that sedation with benzodiazepines until their bodies go through all the symptoms of withdrawal can save an individual from dying as a result of delirium tremors. Yeah, that's the basics. There's a lot more info on D2L if you look at some of those resources that I shared. But I want to see if there's anybody who wants to say or share or ask anything about alcohol. We have a very short section on tobacco, so we're just going to keep going 15 minutes and then we'll be done. Yeah.
When it comes to alcoholics, is it more common for them to be addicted to low proof alcohol or like higher proof? So are they more addicted to like common beers or
So it usually becomes a result of finances. So if people are drinking, I don't know, 2/3 of a case of beer, that gets a little expensive. I mean, unless you're drinking really cheap beer, which eventually they do, but eventually, rather than drinking so much, they'll just switch to liquor. Yeah. And the problem is when you have to sit and drink almost a case of beer, that takes a lot of time. Whereas it doesn't take a lot of time to drink a fifth of liquor. So the body absorption rate is totally different between the intake of beer and liquor. So it's a lot, liquor's quicker. What else? All right. Let's just talk a little bit about tobacco. Let's see. I started smoking when I started college. It was kind of a peer pressure thing to do. I went to college in like 1984. Maybe not so much today. And as soon as I had a severe craving for a cigarette, I didn't like that craving. And I'm like, wow, this is what they're talking about addiction, like being addicted to cigarettes. And I just didn't like it. I didn't want to feel like I had to have something because I like to be in control. But that's just as bad. But but yeah, so I stopped. But I got just a little glimpse of kind of cigarette addiction. Uh, so worldwide, tobacco costs the world $1 trillion a year in medical expenses. 800 million people die each year as a result of tobacco use. 800 million. So I'm just sharing some of these stats I found with you. 34% of all men in the world use tobacco in some way. 7% of women. There are 2,500 chemicals in the natural tobacco plant. 4,000 chemicals in processed cigarettes, including minor amounts of cyanide. So here's the interesting thing. They also talk about, okay, so how's this work in our bodies? So it binds with acetylcholine receptors, crosses the blood-brain barrier. It creates epinephrine, which is adrenaline. That's what keeps soldiers or anybody more alert. It also bonds with GABA, creates vasopressin, an endorphin, and but here we're talking about GABA again. So there's that similarity. And it also creates acetyl acetal, I don't even know how to pronounce. Let's see. Acetaldehyde. I don't know. acetaldehyde. Anyway, sorry I can't pronounce that. Acetaldehyde. 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 All right, I'm gonna have to look that one up. All right, so but anyway, it's the first metabolite of ethyl alcohol. So there's definitely a connection between the way people become addicted with tobacco and the way people become addicted with alcohol. And that contributes to the dependence. So I'm not going to go into a lot with tobacco other than it's probably, the most dangerous substance we put in our bodies on a regular basis. I mean, 800 million people die each year. So, Gracie, another reason. All right. Any questions or comments about alcohol or tobacco? I tried to kind of glean the most important parts of this for you. I know my pronunciation of some of these chemicals isn't perfect, especially that last one. But yeah, questions, comments? All right. I will be grading at least your first discussion post this weekend, maybe your second as well. So your assignment is, do discussion post 3, but start this assignment and decide what you're going to quit. All right, that's a wrap. We will see you next week. Have a good one.